Good morning and welcome to the Caregiver Teleconnection. My name is Glenda Rogers and I'm going to be your facilitator for today's session. And I'm very happy to tell you that today we have Dr. Barry Jacobs with us. He's one of our usual presenters. Today, Barry is going to be talking about what new family caregivers need to know, and that's a really important topic. Before he gets started, let me tell you just a little bit about Dr. Jacobs. He is a clinical psychologist, family therapist, and a principal in the Philadelphia office of Health Management Associates. He is the co-author, with his wife, Julia Mayer, of the 2020 book, AARP, Love and Meaning After 50, The 10 Challenges to Great Relationships and How to Overcome Them. One of those challenges is spousal caregiving. He is also the co-author of AARP, Meditations for Caregivers, Practical, Emotional, and Spiritual Support for You and Your Family, and the author of the Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers, Looking After Yourself and Your Family While Helping an Aging Parent. Very welcome to the session today.
Thank you so much, Glenda, and thank you all for being here today. It's always a pleasure to be here on Caregiver Teleconnections. And as Glenda said, we like to make this more of a conversation, make this as interactive as possible. And so I have some material I'll be presenting. I'll be asking you some questions, and we'll all learn from one another. I'll learn from you just as well as you'll learn from me, and maybe more importantly, you'll learn from one another. Glenda told you a little bit about my professional background, but as I always kind of hasten to add, I have had two experiences, extended experiences as a family caregiver in my own life. Once when I was a teenager and my dad had brain cancer and eventually died of brain cancer. But then about 10, 12 years ago, there was a 7-year period during which I took care of my mom and my stepfather, both of whom had dementia. So I always want to bring up my personal experience because, believe me, it's more important than anything I learned in a textbook in graduate school. So today's topic is what new caregivers need to know, but I also think it's not just for new caregivers, but it's what experienced caregivers need to know. And let me kind of tell you what I have in mind for us today. So what I know I experienced, and believe me, I had been reading about and writing about caregiving for a long time before I suddenly was dealing with my mom's dementia, that I think a lot of folks, if it's a sudden illness that their loved one suffers, like a heart attack or a stroke, or it's a gradual illness that just comes on over a long period of time, like Alzheimer's disease, most people feel lost. They know they have a kind of vague idea of what they're doing may be called caregiving. They may have a vague idea of what they're supposed to be doing, but they're not sure. And one way to try to answer that question of how to not feel lost, how to find a path forward, is to take a look at what we learned from the 45 years of research about caregivers. And I'll be highlighting that, kind of what we've learned from the research about what hurts caregivers and what helps caregivers. And as Glenda mentioned, I have a monthly column that I write about caregiving on the AARP website. And this is from an article I wrote some months ago that, and here is a link to this article that I know when you get this, you get this PowerPoint after this presentation, you'll be able to click on this link and read the article if you're interested. So here's kind of what I have been faced with lots of times in my life. Maybe you have too. Someone will come up to me, and we'll call her, in this case, Brianna. And it may be somebody who's in their 40s or 50s, and we'll say Brianna's 45. And suddenly, maybe she never really thought very much about this before, but she's suddenly dealing with a parent, in this case, her mother, who is dealing with dementia. And as I mentioned, it could be a stroke, it could be cancer, it could be Parkinson's disease. There are many things our loved ones suffer. And that, in this case, Brianna was trying to figure out how to best help her mom, who had just been diagnosed with dementia. So she was in the early stages. She was feeling a little lost about what it is that she was facing and what it is that she was supposed to do to help her mom. She knew that she was a caregiver, that much she knew. Some lots of times people don't even realize that they're caregivers. They just think of themselves as being a good daughter. But that she had heard that being a caregiver was terrible, that it was really an awful thing. And the truth is that even no matter how terrible it may be, she wanted to do a good job because she loves her mom. She wants to really help her mom, and she wants to make sure that her mom is well cared for during this time. But like lots of us, she doesn't just have one family responsibility. She's got multiple family roles and responsibilities. And so she's got a husband, she's got her own kids, she's got a job. She has to spread herself around lots of people and lots of responsibilities, and doesn't know how to balance all that. So imagine Brianna, and let me ask you a question and love to get your ideas. So what do you think if Brianna was coming to you? Brianna is a friend of yours or a neighbor, and she knocks on your door and she says, I know you've been doing this caregiving thing for a while. What do I need to know in order to do a good job with my mom? And she might even ask you, what was the most important thing you learned when you first started being a caregiver? So as Glenda said, you can put your answer in the chat box. You can raise your hand and Glenda will call on you. Or you could you can just unmute yourself and start talking. So I see one thing in the chat box here, and it's Trina says, seek help early. And Trina, I'd love to hear more about what early means. How early is early? Cheryl says, try to balance your life. Cheryl, that sounds like really good advice, but I got to tell you, it is easier said than done. So if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more, how do you balance your life? What do you do to make that effort? And Mill says, I learned the value of patience. And I would say to you, having taken care of my mom and stepdad who both had dementia, that patience is absolutely essential. Tina says, you do not have to do this alone, which I think, Tina, we all sort of know, but many folks feel like they're supposed to do this and that it's on their shoulders, and they don't, you reach out for help, and when help is offered to them, they don't often use the help that's offered to them. But you are absolutely correct. They don't have to do this alone. Lisa says, do your research on the disease. Excellent, excellent advice, Lisa, because, people don't really know what dementia is. They don't know what the course of dementia is likely to be over time, and it does change. And it's good to know that going in. This is all excellent advice so far. Crystal says, don't expect perfect, show yourself grace. Another excellent piece of advice, because Crystal, is what you're suggesting here is that people do expect perfect. They're very self-critical. They are really tough on themselves. And what I often say to them is you're beating yourself up, you're rubbing salt in your own wounds. But to show yourself grace, to give yourself a little bit of latitude that you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. This is a learning process. Tanya says, find a support system. Excellent advice. Terry says, remember to care for yourself. And Tina says, you can't pour from an empty cup. These are all things that I think all fall under the category of self-care. That self-care is essential if you want to do a good job. Kevin says, make a list of people, friends, family, and pros who you can call on when you need help. Beginning and end of each day, take time to inventory yourself and honestly evaluate. So really make sure you got a good team of people there behind you, and then to check in with yourself a lot. And here, Melanie, you said something which, I wish I could live this, I still struggle with what you've written down here. Trying not to feel guilty. That's like saying, trying not to, not to breathe. I mean, sometimes the guilt just is there. It's very hard to not feel guilty. I would go as far as to say, try not to feel too guilty, because we're going to feel guilty. We're going to feel guilty because our loved one's going to suffer, and we're going to feel like, oh my, we can't, I'm supposed to help them not suffer. We're going to feel guilty because we're not perfect. And, if at one time we got irritated with them, we're going to be dwelling on that. We're going to feel guilty because we're going to forget to pick up the pills from the pharmacy one time. And then we're going to feel guilty about that. Or I got to tell you, when I was a caregiver, I felt constantly guilty that the time I was spending with my mom, I wasn't spending with my wife or with my teenage children at that time. And so I couldn't balance myself well enough to not feel guilty. But Melanie, it's a good thought. Crystal says, make a list of routine tasks for when someone offers to help. Crystal, an excellent idea. I had a caregiver I worked with years ago, and what she did is she had a box of index cards, and on each index card, she had a different task. And people said, let me know what I can do to help you. And she would whip out the box of index cards and said, take a look at go through these index cards and tell me which one you want to do. So she made people commit to doing something very specific, which is a really good idea. Kevin says, let the person I am caring for do as much as possible. Be there like bumper guards in bowling lanes. Kevin, I like that. We don't want to infantilize people. We want to encourage them to do as much as they can for as long as they can. And we're there to kind of supervise or to give them just a little bit of guidance, as you would with the bumper guards in a bowling lane. And Trina says, get all estate wills and power of attorney, etc., in order. Every bit of this advice that you folks have given is excellent advice. And I'm afraid I have nothing to teach you today. No, hopefully that's not true. But I mean, really and truly, this is excellent advice. And so a lot of good experience and good sense among the group on this call today. So I think if Brianna heard all that, she's going to think, wow, that's a lot of different things to remember. Maybe there are just 3 or 4 things I should remember. I see one other piece of advice, just Glenda saying, wow, great advice, everyone. Thanks for the input. So I'm going to give you 7 pieces of advice. Even that's probably too many for Brianna to, because at the beginning when people are just feeling overwhelmed, they can only take in a little bit, they can't take in a lot. But I'm still going to go ahead and give 7 pieces of advice that come directly out of the research. Kevin's got one more piece of advice here. Don't depend on my own memory. Write, journal, document. Kevin, you got a lot of good ideas here. All right, let me go forward. All right, so I'm going to bet you a lot of the advice that folks have given so far is really just coming things that you've read, things that you've learned at caregiver support groups, things you've learned from your own experience. So maybe because I'm a psychologist, I'm supposed to be a little bit more academic. I like to read caregiving research, and there's a lot of it. I mean, there's been a lot written in nursing and social work and psychology and medicine. And the research, the things that have been researched over the last almost half century have been how many caregivers are there in this country, and how are caregivers affected by caregiving, and what helps caregivers become more resilient, and how are different types of caregiving challenging in different ways. So it's very different if you're an adult child caring for a parent versus your spouse is the one who has dementia, or you're caring for a child with chronic illness. And it's also very different if you're caring for someone who has dementia versus cancer. The diseases are different. They cause different problems. The caregiving is shaped differently by your loved one's condition. So caregiving research has studied a lot of these questions here to try to give us some advice as to how to go forward. So here's advice, piece of advice number 1, and I'm going to ask you all what you think of each of these pieces of advice. So here's the first piece of advice, and I like to give this piece of advice to folks, is caregiving is hard. It really is hard, but it's not impossible. And I would say to Brianna, it's not terrible either. It is hard, but it's not terrible. And so to demonstrate that caregiving is hard, but not impossible, I'm going to suggest that, every 5 years or so, there's a survey that AARP and the National Alliance for Caregiving do in this country called the Caregiving in the US report. The last time it was done in this country was in 2020. And at that time, it found that there are about 53 million Americans who do some caregiving in the course of a year. And their reactions to caregiving really vary tremendously, depending on the person, who the person is, what the relationship is to the person they're caring for, what the circumstances of their lives are. So what that survey found, and the one from 2015, the one from 2010 found similar things, is that about a third of caregivers find caregiving highly stressful. And when caregivers find caregiving highly stressful, then those caregivers are more prone to some of the negative effects of caregiving, such as becoming depressed, getting anxious, having sleep problems, maybe having back and neck pain, literally from having to help people get in and out of bed, up and down the stairs. So about a third of folks are highly stressed. About a half of folks are somewhat stressed. And if someone had asked me, or if I had taken this survey during the years that I was my mom and my stepdad's caregiver, what my reaction to caregiving was, they gave me multiple choices to choose among, I would have said I was somewhat stressed. I mean, I wasn't overwhelmed, but there were times that were tough. I didn't like sitting in the emergency room. I didn't like it when my mom or stepfather fell and I had to pick them up off the floor. And then there's a group of folks that are not at all, say that they're not at all stressed by caregiving, that these are many of these folks don't even identify themselves as caregivers. They identify themselves as dutiful daughters, dutiful sons, dutiful wives, doing what they think family members are supposed to do, and they don't seem to be stressed by it. So looking at these statistics, we can say that the majority of folks, 85% or so of folks find caregiving stressful. About half of them find it somewhat stressful, but that, generally speaking, people manage to muddle through. And what I always like to say is that caregiving brings strains. It certainly strains folks, but it also brings gains. People gain a sense of personal mastery. They grow spiritually, they grow personally as a result of all the work that they're doing on behalf of a loved one. So before I go on, we talk about other pieces of advice that come directly from the research. Anybody have any thoughts or questions about this first piece of advice that caregiving is hard but not impossible? Agree or disagree?
And also, if you called in on your telephone, you can press *6 on your individual phone and join the conversation. I'll call on you by your area code. We do have a couple of people that have phoned in.
Great, thank you, Glenda. Is this advice you would give to Brianna or anybody else? You might say to them, this is tough, but you can do this.
We do have one caller, Barry, that has unmuted his telephone from area code 443. Please go right ahead.
Yes, question. Are you going to speak to the fact of how much caregiving has changed in our new world of viruses? Because there's so many viruses out here now. And the new thing is that a lot of times caregivers are sicker. And therefore, I don't know whether the quality of the other people's lives is going to change or not, but I know a caregiver who got COVID and they have the lingering COVID, so they're out of the game now. So now the person has no one to really follow up and care for them. So is that part of your study?
So today, I have given talks on COVID and caregiving before, but that's not part of today's talk. But I could just tell you that absolutely COVID has made caregiving harder. So, what we could say with this piece of advice is caregiving is harder and COVID makes it much harder. and maybe COVID sometimes makes it impossible if you're afraid of giving the virus to someone you're caring for. But unless it's a circumstance like that, I would say caregiving is not impossible. People manage most of the time. But I'm not going to really say more about COVID today than that.
I think you'll probably.
No, I was just saying that.
I was going to say, I think you can find Barry's presentation on that topic on the Caregiver Teleconnection website also.
No, well, I'm not saying the COVID. I'm saying the change, because circumstances do change, but because of COVID is not, it's not like you had an accident, or it's always a possibility something changed. But with COVID, if you are knocked out of the game because you are no longer able to function yourself, and maybe you're going to need to have help, I was wondering how that affects the caregiving, not COVID itself. It's just the
Sure.
health of the other.
So I'll tell you a family story, and that is my father-in-law had multiple strokes, and my mother-in-law was his caregiver. And my mother-in-law basically quit her job, stayed home with my father-in-law all the time, took care of him all the time. But my mother-in-law had her own heart problems that she didn't take good care of. And because she would say, well, if I have to go to the doctor for myself, then I'm not there for my husband. And P.S., because my mother-in-law didn't take care of herself, didn't take care of her own medical needs, she died. She died before her husband. And then my wife and her 3 siblings had to take care of their mother, their father, who had the strokes. And they lost their mother, who unfortunately was so focused on caregiving that she didn't take care of herself. So whether we're talking about any kind of health condition that the caregiver may get, if they don't take care of themselves, then they're not going to be able to take care of the person that they are committed to caring for. And I have seen other caregivers, not just my mother-in-law, I've seen other caregivers die before the care receiver. They just wear themselves out, unfortunately. I see some other comments here that looks like people say that caregiving is hard but not impossible. Cheryl says, I would say it is hard without help and support. Crystal says, I also agree with Kevin and Pamela. That being said, we sometimes make it harder on ourselves by thinking caregiving looks one specific way, or comparing ourselves to other caregivers we think are better at it because they do it differently from us. So that what I'm hearing you say, Crystal, is we make caregiving harder when we judge ourselves negatively. We think we're not as good as another caregiver. And I would just say in life in general, when people are very self-critical, they often make their lives harder. Trina says caregiving is hard but not impossible with the right support system. So you agree with Cheryl. Crystal says absolutely. Okay, so I think what you did is we said now caregiving is hard but not impossible if you have the right support systems. We've qualified that piece of advice. I think that's a very reasonable change to make in this piece of advice. Let me give you piece of advice number 2. Not every caregiver runs the same risk of depression. So I mentioned to you that the folks that are most highly stressed, that 1/3 of folks who are most highly stressed, are more likely to have some of the negative effects of being a caregiver, including depression. So who has higher risk of depression? Well, if you have a personal history of having had major clinical depression, or a family history of major depression or clinical depression, you are at higher risk than the person who's never had a history of depression. If you are someone who feels that you have no choice about being a caregiver, I have had many people basically said, I'm forced to do this, I'm trapped by this. Those folks who feel helpless, that they can't make a change, they're forced to be a caregiver, they're at higher risk for depression than the person who said, I choose to be a caregiver because it's an important thing for me to do. And I intend to do this. The person who feels like they're making their own, doing this out of their own free will is less likely to become depressed. Person who cares for someone with dementia is at higher risk of someone who cares for someone with another type of disease. So it's awfully tough to care for someone who has cancer. It can be heartbreaking to see somebody suffering with cancer, to see someone die from cancer. But there's something about dementia, to see someone slowly over time kind of becoming more forgetful, becoming more confused, maybe becoming agitated, that makes dementia caregiving the hardest type of caregiving. And the harder the caregiving, the more likely someone is to get depressed. And then finally, if the person who provides care for over 25 hours a week is more likely to suffer depression than the person who provides care for less than 25 hours a week. That amount of care, that just the sheer volume of care, has an impact on whether the caregiver wears out and whether they get despondent and depressed. So again, this piece of advice is not everyone runs at the same depression risk. And what that means is, with the caregiving you're doing, you need to reflect on what is your risk for depression. Do you have a personal history? Do you feel like you have a choice? Are you caring for someone with dementia? How much caregiving are you doing? So let's see a comment I have here from Lisa. She says, for some people, the caregiver, it's hard to make the adjustment. You have been used to living your own life. They don't deal well. I had a client that had to move her mother in with her, and she did not deal well with it. So what I'm hearing you say, Lisa, is that there's some people who can make the adjustment, the change of roles, easier than others. And that's true. I mean, I think that there are folks that basically say, well, I'm ready to set aside my job and my hobbies and maybe some of my friendships right now, so I can just focus on caring for my relative. And there are others who say, my God, how can I sacrifice all this? I've worked so hard for this job. I don't want to sacrifice it. And they really have a difficult time doing that. So that's another way that caregiving affects people, just given their how flexible they are, how adaptable they are, given the changes in their lives. Any other thoughts about this idea that not everyone runs the same depression risk? Again, this comes directly out of the research. I'm hearing you guys have been fairly interactive, and now we seem like we've gotten to a place where, I don't know if you're kind of scratching your heads and saying, or you don't believe this, or this is a little bit uncomfortable to talk about. What are you thinking?
Well, I was thinking that, yes, I'm feeling kind of depressed about, because I'm getting this information for someone I know, and I don't think he's recognizing his depression. So how can I, because he's doing what he is supposed, he feels like he's supposed to do. He's caring for his wife, and it's like, sometimes it's hard to get one or two words out of him just to say what he's feeling. So I wouldn't even know how to say, maybe you need to take some time off. I wouldn't know how to advise him.
Cheryl, I promise you, as we go through this, I'm going to give you some specific things to say to him.
Okay.
Okay. Melanie says, I'm on the higher risk side, being an only child. And so and I think that's probably true, Melanie. I think it's harder. It's easier when you got a big group of people who can be a whole support system, and versus having it all on your shoulders. But let me also say, the more people you have involved, the more people you have with their own opinions, and the more possibility of conflict there is. Because one of the most difficult things for caregivers that I've seen over the years is when you have, say, a group of adult siblings and they can't agree on anything. And all the old rivalries among those siblings come back to the surface, and people are arguing with one another, and sometimes getting pretty darn angry at one another. And that makes the caregiving harder too. So I wouldn't just say that being an only child is makes you at higher risk. Sometimes having a bunch of siblings may put you, who you don't get along with, could put you at higher risk too. So it's a little complicated. Trina says, good to use as an eval, I can use to lower risk. So people ought to know, be thinking about what risk they may have here. So I can see that you guys are kind of pondering this idea of having, different people have different risks for depression. We could say the same thing. We have different people have different risks for back pain from lifting people. There are people who are younger, maybe their backs are in better shape. There are people whose backs, have been injured previously. They're going to be at higher risk. We can think about all kinds of things that, people are at greater risk for one thing versus another because of their history, because of the transfer techniques they're using. But in this case, we're talking specifically about depression. Let me show you piece of advice number 3. Social isolation hurts caregivers. So a number of you have already said that having a support system is very important to help caregivers cope, so that caregiving is not impossible. Caregiving is hard, but not impossible if you have a support system. But what I have seen in my experience is that sometimes caregivers get so caught up in all the things that they have to do that it's like they disconnect from the rest of the world. They withdraw from other people. At the same time, some of those other people somehow disappear, that they don't come around anymore. They don't call, they don't text, they go back to their own lives. And so the combination of caregivers withdrawing and friends and family members somehow slowly over time disappearing can lead caregivers to experience what is now called social isolation. And social isolation has been studied a lot in the last 10 years, and the research is alarming because people who are isolated, really isolated, particularly older adults who are isolated, they have worse physical health, they have worse mental health, and the health risk associated with social isolation has been estimated to be the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So the idea here is, this is not only true for caregivers, but true for folks in general. The more human beings are connected to one another, the more support they have, the better they cope with life's adversities. The more isolated they are, the more alone they are, the more lonely they feel, the more they suffer in silence, and the worse their own health becomes. We want caregivers to be connected. We don't want caregivers to be isolated. So I see a lot of answers, of comments here. Let me see what folks are saying. Let me catch up to you. All right. All right. All right. Okay. Okay. I see a whole lot of comments here. So let me try to catch up. Melanie, Kevin says, definitely establish a board of directors and especially a CEO. That's talking about dealing with siblings. Thank you, Kevin. Crystal says, I think it's true that the risk for depression varies from person to person. I think what poses a greater risk is how we tend to cope with stress in general. Do we self-isolate? And that would speak directly to what's on the screen right now. Do we look for help support? Are we knowledgeable about the resources available to us? And will we avail ourselves of that? Yes. I agree with everything you just said, Crystal. We don't want folks to be isolated. We want them to use whatever resources are available to them. Diana says, agreed. I'm a sibling of 5, only myself and a sister. Others are in denial of both parents with this illness. And so, Diana, this is in reference to the comments I was making to Melanie, that sometimes having a large group of siblings can be not just not helpful, but especially not helpful, because I'm sure you have feelings about the siblings who are in denial and are not helping at all. Kevin says, identify what I'm capable of and things I'm not, and learn to find help according to specific roles. And you agree that isolation is the very worst part. There's Glenda saying, great comments, thank you. Pamela says, siblings call to suggest what needs to be done, but aren't around long enough to help get it done, causes frustration. Don't you hate that, Pamela? My brother would do this to me all the time. He would call from afar. He lived 500 miles away. He would call me and give me all sorts of quote unquote helpful suggestions that I should do, right? And I couldn't stand that. So yeah, siblings are famous for doing that. Kevin, and there's a whole conversation going on here about siblings. Kevin says, I make a calendar and assign specific times, days to be with friends, whether they come over when I can't leave or for me to get out and about. Good. Kevin, you're talking about staying connected to other people. And Harry says, second guessing myself is one of my greatest causes of stress, whether what I'm doing is the best option for the ones I'm caring for. And I would say that second guessing, the second guessing that most of us do, kind of sometimes falls into the category of being self-critical. And like I said, self-criticism doesn't help us. Self-criticism usually just makes people feel lousy and makes caregiving or any part of life more difficult. So Terry, I agree with what you're saying.
Barry, Mike, well, wait a minute, he did, but he closed it off again. Sorry, I thought we had somebody that had opened their phone.
Okay, well, Mike, feel free to open up again if you want. But I am hearing that, most folks, you resonated strongly with the sibling comments, and we can talk about that more some other time. I think I have presented on that in the past. Mm-hmm. But here, I think everyone agrees that isolation it's not good for caregivers, and that we have to strive to not become isolated. See one other comment here. Trina says, social isolation has benefited somewhat from COVID. Many more ways to connect virtually now. That's agreed. True. I would say to you, thank God, here I am sitting in Philadelphia and you're sitting wherever you are. And isn't it amazing? I mean, that we can have this conversation and I can show you slides and we can all talk together. But to my way of thinking, seeing people in person is even better than virtually. So this is second best, but it's not bad. All right. Let's go on to the third piece of advice. And this is really connected to the last one. Social connection helps a lot. And that is one of the most robust findings in research is that when people feel supported by others, that they are less likely to become depressed. And this goes along with the sibling comment. If you're connected with other people, it's most beneficial when those are harmonious connections, not conflicted connections. And that when caregivers are connected by others that feel they can validate their experience, the kind of connection that often occurs within a caregiver support group, or maybe on a phone call like this, or a presentation like this, when caregivers feel that other people get them, understand them, validate their experience, then people feel less alone. They feel less alone with all the caregiving burden they're experiencing. I see a couple more comments here. Let me go up a little bit here. I see Lisa says, I work with the area agency on aging and we have respite that I definitely encourage caregivers to look into. Agreed, Lisa, I think it is, but I will also tell you that most caregivers never use respite because they feel too ashamed of the idea of using respite, which is a shame. Kevin says, I suggest also making your own small support group made up of friends who are dealing with the same thing. I have a Facebook page with about 10 of my friends who do it or have done it. That's certainly a way of remaining connected virtually, and it's a great idea. And Glenda says, area agencies on aging are located throughout the country. Many times they seem to be a hidden resource. Call 911 and connect with your local area.
211.
211. 911 is a little different. 211.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. No, that's good. Good advice. Thank you, Glenda. Okay. This one is very similar to the last one. I'm going to go on to the next one. All right. It just says here, making a positive difference. But what the piece of advice is that if you're a caregiver and you feel like you're actually helping, that you're making a positive difference, then you feel better. And again, if if Brianna was knocking on your door and, a piece of advice you could give to her is to say, whatever you do to help your mom, make sure that it really is helpful. Because when you know that you're really helping her, that she feels that you're helping her, that's going to help you feel better too. So what some of the research says is that when a care receiver suffers, oftentimes caregivers feel suffering as well. But that when a caregiver can relieve a care receiver's suffering, then they feel a little bit better. So I'll tell you a quick personal story on this, and that is, toward the end of his life, my stepfather had very advanced dementia, and he was in a nursing home. And my mother at that point was still well enough that I would take her to the nursing home to visit him. And if she could get him to eat his lunch that day, and he enjoyed his lunch that day, my mother had felt that she had relieved his suffering a little bit, and that made her feel really good. She would leave the nursing home that day feeling that she had made a positive difference. It wasn't that she was changing his dementia at all. His dementia was still as bad as it ever was, but that she was able to provide him with food and a little bit of comfort. And that helped her feel like she was doing something to help him. And I would just also say that when people have a sense of making a positive difference or a sense of personal meaning about caregiving, it often helps caregivers cope better. So many times you ask when I ask caregivers why they do what they're doing for a loved one, they'll say they want to give back to that person because that person took very good care of them in the past, and then now they want to give some of that back. Or if they have a religious orientation, they may say that they're doing God's work in this world. Or there are people who will say, it's really important for me to support my family, that a family is very important to me, and therefore I want to make a difference, a positive difference in the life of my family. And when people have those positive meanings about the work that they're doing, rather than just feeling like, oh my God, I'm trapped, I hate this is awful, but to have those positive meanings really makes the caregiving go better. So any thoughts about making a positive difference and how making a positive difference has a positive effect on caregivers? Am I stating the obvious here? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. Are you guys still out there?
They're there.
All right, they're there. Okay, thank you, Linda. I wasn't sure. All right, I will go on. Caregivers learn a lot. They learn a lot about the disease. They learn a lot about the treatments for the disease. They learn a lot about how to navigate the healthcare system. They learn a lot about area agencies on aging and home health aides and adult daycare programs. And they learn about transfer techniques, and they learn about diapers and all kinds of things they learn about. And as they learn, they get better. They get better at being a caregiver. And at some point in time, caregivers can kind of stop and pause and reflect, and they can put up their hand and reach around and pat themselves in the back and say, you know what? I'm doing a darn good job here. Because when I first started, I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about dealing with health insurance. I didn't know anything about having to navigate through the healthcare system. But I've learned, I figured it out, and now I actually know something to help my loved one, but maybe also to give advice to other people about how to help their loved ones. I've gotten good at this job, and as a result of getting good at this job, I've gained some confidence, and I've grown personally, and perhaps I've grown spiritually as well. So caregivers do gain a sense of mastery, and that sense of mastery over the caregiving job helps them cope better. So Trina says, nothing worse than sacrificing time, energy, and resources and to feel like it is not effectively helping. And that's absolutely true, Trina. We want to make even some small difference, to know that what we're doing, even for someone who's got a dire diagnosis, that it's making the quality of their lives for as long as they're around as good as possible. Crystal says, I think this is where support groups come into play. We share knowledge and support and feel a purpose beyond caregiving. And so, Crystal, what I'm hearing is, having learned about caregiving, having gained a sense of mastery of skills and systems of care that exist out there, and to be able to share that information with other people, to educate them, to make their path a little easier, that's a way of making a positive difference for them, and gives you a sense of purpose that's gratifying, that's important. Kevin says, if we can share the things we learn along the way, it definitely gives us a confidence boost. Absolutely. And I think I'm going to go so far as to say that's what I think a lot of you are doing on today's call, that you're sharing things with one another, that you've learned, that things that matter, things that could make a difference in someone else's journey. And that's extremely important. All right, let's go on. And here is one of the last pieces of advice. And I know you hear this piece of advice pretty much all the time. Probably you heard this piece of advice long before you ever became a caregiver, but it's true. And there are two components here. So the first component of this is physical exercise matters. That regular cardio aerobic exercise, that research has found it's as effective as psychotherapy or medication for reducing mild to moderate depression. And so what is cardio aerobic exercise? Basically, it's exercise which you get your heart rate up a little bit, your breathing rate, and you're sweating. You know, if you're just having a walk, that's nice, and you know the fresh air is good for you and good to stretch your legs. But if you jog a little bit, if you work out on a treadmill or an elliptical at a gym, and you get a little sweat going, your body releases endorphins into your bloodstream. Endorphins are kind of the body's own natural antidepressant, and it's very, very important way to cope emotionally, and it's also very important for your physical health. So there are folks in the world who love cardio aerobic exercise. I love cardio aerobic exercise, and there are people who hate it, and I get it. But in general, it's a pretty important thing for physical wellness and emotional wellness. And then I'm just going to say, and we're not going to, mindfulness is a whole big topic unto itself. Mindfulness are things like yoga or meditation. It could be, just deep breathing exercises, but things that help us get into a more relaxed state of mind. That, mindfulness, any of those mindfulness exercises has been associated with decreased anxiety and depression. That mindfulness is another thing that we can all incorporate into our lives to make dealing with caregiving easier, and to just feel healthier than we have felt otherwise. I see a comment here, and Kevin says, when the Texas heat kicked up, we found ourselves cooped up, a little option for exercise. We got a recumbent bike, and it was so helpful. That's great, Kevin. I think that's a great idea. I mean, if you can't exercise outside, and exercising indoors matters. I mean, you could just be doing jumping jacks. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Jack LaLanne was on TV and doing calisthenics, right, with a chair in your living room, right? Glenda, you're laughing. You remember too.
I remember it.
Yeah, he was Jack LaLanne. If anybody remembers him, he was probably a guy in his 50s, maybe even his 60s, and he looked like $1 million. He was like rippling with muscles and a full head of hair. And he would teach very simple exercises you could do in your home. It would get a good sweat going in your home. You didn't have to go, you didn't have to even buy expensive equipment with Jack LaLanne. Crystal said, I think if we look at how our bodies are designed, we understand why this is so important. Great. And Pamela says, I remember Jack. Yeah. Jack, not too many people remember him anymore, but Jack was ahead of his time in terms of recommending exercise, regular cardio aerobic exercise, to help us cope better. So I gave you my 7 pieces of advice, probably too many for Brianna. It will probably be overwhelming for her. I see a couple pieces of advice here. Crystal said they came on Nick at Night when I was younger. Okay, that's good. I'm a lot older than you, Crystal. I mean, Nick at Night came around way after I saw Jacqueline. Kevin says Jack's videos are on YouTube. Great resource for motion indoors. I had no idea, Kevin. That's good to know. But
I didn't either.
Not surprising. You can look up the Jack LaLanne videos on YouTube.
Wow.
But you know, but here we just went through all the advice. So what thoughts or questions or other pieces of advice do you think caregivers need to know? What would be what else would you add to this, or what would you change?
You know, before everybody jumps in, and we certainly want to hear from them, I wanted to go back to the lady that called, Barry, and you can probably join in on this. You know, one of the common threads that we've heard over time is that you need to have a plan in place, a written plan, and that's what kept coming to mind as I kept thinking about the lady asking us about what do you do? Well, if you have a written plan in place, I don't care if you get hit by a bus, then you have something that somebody can pick up and take over the caregiving duties and know what needs to happen. And I think she was struggling with that.
I mean, Glenda, why don't you go on with that, because you were saying something very important. So please.
Well, for any caregiver, no matter what the situation, we have, and almost preached over time, that you need to write down everything that is important. And one of those things that is important is what happens to you as the caregiver if there's an emergency. What if you have to go to the hospital? What if you get COVID? If you have a written plan in place that describes who's going to take over certain activities, who's going to stay with mom, you know, all of those kinds of things. Who are the resources that we've been talking about today? Who are the contacts? Then it alleviates some of the stress that goes along with an emergency situation. And that's kind of what I wanted to say to the lady that called in on the telephone and the comments she was making.
Well, you should. I mean, Glenda, those are great comments. I hope she's still on. But
she is. So I wanted to say that before we got off.
Good. And then I'll just say the two other questions here. Looks like Jill says my husband has Parkinson's, and sometimes I lose patience and get angry. Then I feel bad about myself. I'm going to tell you, Jill, you're in really, really good company. I'm going to tell you that almost every caregiver I've ever met has moments of irritability or anger. I certainly had a lot of anger when I was in the prime of my caregiving years, and that was and you got to, you know, what we talked a lot about is a need for patience, but also the need for self-forgiveness, to not be critical of yourself. We're not perfect. We're imperfect human beings. We're going to get irritable at times. We're going to speak harshly at times, and that's not what we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on all the good things that we do and to try to do better in the future. I see one other question here from Trina. What advice do you have for emergency respite if no care plan is in place? And I would say to you, Trina, most area agencies on aging have some sort of respite plan available. And I would start with your area agency on aging to see what they could offer you if you don't have other family members who could step in. And finally, I see, where can we find other videos or articles by Barry Jacobs? There are lots of other caregiver teleconnections on the WellMed Charitable Foundation website that I think that Glenda's can give out the links to that, but I've done many of these caregiver teleconnections over the years. And then my articles, I mean, I have lots and lots of articles on the AARP website. If you go to aarp.org, you put in the search engine, you put in Barry Jacobs, and a bunch of them will pop up. But there is, and then I have 2 books I've written on caregiving, as Glenda mentioned earlier. And I see 2 other comments, and then we'll end for now. Kevin says, the road to success is paved with failures that become learning experiences. I think he's saying that in reference to you, Jill. We fall down at times and then we get up. We speak harshly at times and then we try to compensate for it by learning patience and not speaking harshly the next time. But the irritability, the imperfection is normal. And we'll give Lisa says, if your loved one is on hospice, there are some agencies that will provide respite, which would be placement in a facility, to provide you a break. So hospice does this, area agencies on aging do this. So if your family can't provide hospice, or neighbors can't, if your family can't provide respite, or your neighbors can't provide respite, there are other professional agencies that can do this. Thank you very much for your attention. Minerva says if you go to our website, and here's the Caregiver Teleconnection website, you can go and do a search for Barry Jacobs, it will come up. Thank you, Minerva. I also have done a lot of interviews on the radio show Caregiver SOS over the years. You can look up some of those too if you like that, or you can just wait 3 months and I'll be back again. So look forward to seeing everybody soon. Glenda, thank you so much for your help.
Thank you. And one more thing about the emergency respite, part of your plan might want to be that you find local long-term care facilities that offer temporary respite, so you can have that part of your plan. Something happens to me, call this facility, and so one final thing about that. We are certainly glad you're with us today. The August calendar is out and it is jam-packed full of informative sessions. So I'd encourage you to get a hold of that calendar. It is up on the website also. As I said early on, if you register for this call, you will receive a follow-up email in a couple of days. It will have Barry's PowerPoint presentation attached to it, along with a survey. We'd like to hear from you. If you have other topics, other presenters that you would like to see on the Caregiver Teleconnection, please tell us that in that follow-up survey, so that we can get in touch with them and offer you sessions which are important to you, which offer information that will help you in your caregiving journey. So I want to thank you all for being with us today. I want to thank Barry again. I love being with him every 3 months or so. Love his presentations. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a wonderful day. And for those of you in Texas, stay inside. Bye-bye.
Bye.